There is a silence that exists before the world breaks. It is a quiet filled with the ordinary sounds of life. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the soft crackle of a dying fire. It is a deceptive peace, and it is in this peace that our story begins, not with a shout, but with a breath held too long. The red clay of North Carolina sticks to everything. It stains the hands, the clothes, the very soul. For a man named Lazarus, this earth was his entire world. He was a blacksmith, a man whose strength was not just in his arms, but in his spirit. His hands, calloused and sure, could shape iron, bend it to his will, create tools and trinkets from raw, unforgiving metal. In the glow of his forge, he was more than just property. He was a creator, and he was not alone. There was Eleanor. Her voice was a melody that could soften the hardest day. Her presence a shield against the ever-present shadow of their bondage. And then there was Isaiah, their son, a boy with eyes that held a future Lazarus could only dream of. In the cramped confines of their cabin at night, a space that was theirs by permission, not by right, that future almost felt tangible. The love within those walls was a fortress. Their master, John Hawthorne, was a man of business, not of passion. Cruelty for him was not a pleasure but a calculation. He saw the value in Lazarus's skill, in his strength. The work was brutal, the son a merciless overseer, but there was a rhythm, a predictable pattern of sunup to sundown. The lash was always a threat, but for Lazarus it was not a constant companion. He endured the back-breaking labor for the few precious hours of twilight, for the sight of Eleanor humming as she mended clothes, for the weight of Isaiah sleeping in his arms. This was his peace, a fragile borrowed peace. That peace shattered on a day that dawned no different from any other. The sound that broke it was not a thunderclap, but the crisp rustle of paper and the grim tone of men discussing a debt. Hawthorne had overextended himself. The price of his ambition was to be paid not from his own pocket, but from his human stock. Lazarus was at the forge, the heat a familiar comfort, when he saw the overseer, a man named Briggs, walking towards the quarters. He held his hammer still, his senses sharpening. He saw Briggs gesture and his heart stalled in his chest. Eleanor looked up from the wash basin, her hands still dripping. Little Isaiah, playing with a stick in the dirt, was scooped up without a word. A cold dread, colder than any well water, washed over Lazarus. He knew this walk. It was the walk that led to the main house, to the porch, to a future unknown. He dropped his hammer, the clang a hollow, meaningless sound of protest, and began to move, but two other field hands, their faces masks of pity and fear, held him back. "Don't, Lazarus," one whispered, his voice tight. "It won't help. It'll just make it worse." He was forced to watch the scene unfold from a distance, a prisoner in the very place he labored. He saw Master Hawthorne on the porch, his face a stone mask, refusing to meet Lazarus's burning gaze. He saw a man he didn't recognize, a trader with a hard face and cold eyes, dressed in clothes too fine for the dust of the farm. The man gripped Eleanor's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, not as a person but as livestock. But it was Isaiah's face that would be seared into Lazarus's memory forever. The boy's eyes, wide with a terror he couldn't comprehend, searched for his father. In that look was a silent question. Why? Why don't you stop this? Eleanor, in her final moment, did not look at the trader nor at Hawthorne. She turned her head, her body already being led away, and her eyes found Lazarus. It was not a look of despair, not of surrender. It was a look of fierce, unbreakable love, a final, silent plea. "Remember us, remember me, survive." Then the wagon, a simple wooden cart used for hauling crops, became a vessel of utter desolation. The trader shoved them onto the flatbed. The driver snapped the reins. The wheels turned, slowly at first, then picking up speed, churning the red clay into a cloud of dust. Lazarus watched until the figures of his wife and son blurred, faded, and were swallowed whole by the road and the trees. The dust settled. The silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a void. The forge was cold. The cabin was empty. The man who was Lazarus, the husband, the father, the creator, was gone. What remained standing alone in the yard was a shell, a vessel, and within that vessel a new thing was born. It was cold, it was hard, and it was patient. It was the first silent spark of a fire that would one day consume everything. The world did not grant Lazarus time to grieve. Grief was a luxury for free men. For him, there was only the next transaction. John Hawthorne, perhaps feeling a shred of unease, or more likely simply seeing a now disrupted asset, sold Lazarus within the week. The second master was a man named Silas Gable, owner of a timber camp deep in the pine forests. If Hawthorne's oppression was pragmatic, Gable's was personal. He was a man made of gristle and spite, who believed that a broken spirit was more manageable than a broken body. Lazarus was no longer a blacksmith. He was just muscle, another pair of arms to swing an axe in the relentless shadowy expanse of the forest. The work was a new kind of torture. The bite of the axe handle into his palms, the groan of a towering pine before it crashed down, the constant suffocating smell of sap and decay. But the physical strain was nothing compared to the psychological dismantling. Gable made it his mission to erase the man he had bought. He started with the name. Lazarus is a fancy name, Gable sneered on the first day, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey. Sounds like a preacher's name. Here you're Lays. Got it? Lays? 'Cause if I see you lazing about, you'll regret it. It was a small thing, a tiny violence, but it was the first brick in a wall designed to crush his identity. The cruelty was inventive. Gable would point to a felled tree and demand it be moved 10 feet to the left, just to watch the back-breaking effort required. Rations were withheld for the slightest perceived infraction. A dull axe blade, a moment spent catching a breath. Lazarus was forced to sleep in a leaky lean-to with the other lumbermen, the cold seeping into their bones, the sound of the forest at night a chorus of unseen threats. And through it all, Gable would talk. He would stand over them as they worked, delivering monologues on the natural order of things. "A man needs to know his place," he'd say, his voice cutting through the sound of axes. "A tree is meant to be cut, a mule is meant to be driven, and a nitau is meant to be worked. It's God's own truth." He wasn't just breaking their bodies. He was trying to poison their minds to make them believe in their own inferiority. Lazarus said nothing. He absorbed the blows, the hunger, the words. He became a perfect mirror, reflecting back nothing of the storm raging inside him. He was Lays. He swung the axe. He moved the log. But in the silence of his own mind, the name Lazarus became a secret mantra, a prayer to a self he was forced to hide. The cold, hard thing within him grew, fed by every insult, every pang of hunger, every drop of rain that found him in the night. His value as a strong worker saved him from being worked to death. After a year, Gable, needing cash for a land speculation, sold him again. The third master was a different kind of monster altogether. Master number 3 was Josiah P. Pettigrew, a man who wore his respectability like a fine coat. He was a town dweller, a merchant with a large house on the outskirts of Raleigh. He owned a livery stable, and Lazarus was to be his new stable hand. On the surface, it was a step up from the timber camp. There was a roof, regular meals, but Pettigrew's cruelty was a refined, insidious thing. He spoke in a soft, measured tone, but his words were whips. He was a devout man, a deacon in the local church, and he framed his ownership as a form of paternalistic salvation. "I have taken you into my household, Lays," he would say, using Gable's name, cementing the erasure. "I have saved you from a life of brutishness. You should be grateful." Gratitude was the chain he used. Pettigrew demanded perfection. A single piece of straw out of place in a horse's stall warranted a lecture on sloth being a sin against God. The horses were cared for with more overt affection than the enslaved. Lazarus would brush the animals' coats until they shone, all while Pettigrew watched, pointing out a missed spot with the tip of his cane. "See, Lays, even this beast understands the value of a clean presentation. It is a reflection on me, and you are a reflection on me." The hypocrisy was an acid drip. Pettigrew would return from Sunday service, speaking of charity and brotherly love, and then complain that the roasted dinner was overcooked, his voice taking on a sharp edge that promised a silent, later punishment, perhaps the withholding of the next day's meal, or an extra pointless task that would steal hours of sleep. It was here, in the ordered, civilized hell of Pettigrew's stable, that Lazarus's rage began to transform. The blunt force trauma of Gable's cruelty had been straightforward, something to endure. But Pettigrew's method, this veneer of righteousness over a core of absolute control, taught Lazarus a new, dangerous lesson. It taught him about the power of appearances, the lies that men in power tell themselves to sleep at night. He saw the fragility of their morality. He began to watch, not just endure. He learned Pettigrew's routines, his habits, his secret vices, the bottle of brandy he kept hidden in his study, the way he would sometimes shortchange customers at his store. Lazarus saw the man's greed, his pride, his fear of social judgment. These were not just character flaws. To Lazarus, they were weaknesses, points of entry. The cold, hard thing inside him was no longer just a spark of rage. Under Pettigrew's civilizing hand, it was being tempered, forged into a sharp and patient weapon. He was no longer just a man being erased. He was becoming a student of his oppressors. And the lesson he was learning was not one of submission, but of their ultimate vulnerability. The chain of Lazarus's life was forged with links of different metals, each master a new weight, a new lesson in the many faces of human dominion. He was not being passed from owner to owner. He was being passed from professor to professor in a brutal university of suffering. And he was a star pupil. His fourth master, a portly, wheezing man named Alistair Finch, was the greedy. Finch owned a small, struggling plantation where the soil was tired and the cotton grew thin. He was a man consumed by numbers, by balance sheets that never balanced. To him, Lazarus was not a man, not even a tool, but a unit of potential production. A line item. Finch's cruelty was one of pure, unadulterated neglect. He was too cheap to provide adequate food, too miserly to replace worn-out shoes. The slaves' quarters were ramshackle, the roof riddled with holes, the wind a constant, unwelcome guest. Lazarus worked fields that yielded little, his body growing thinner, the hunger a gnawing familiar beast. Finch would ride through the fields on his horse, not with a whip, but with a ledger, muttering calculations under his breath. More hands, less yield. Poor investment. Poor investment. The man saw human misery as a simple matter of poor financial returns. It was here Lazarus learned the power of a system, of an oppression that wasn't personal, but was therefore all the more dehumanizing. There was no one to hate, just a vast, uncaring machine of commerce that grinded men into dust. He learned to despise the system itself, the cold, economic logic that made his suffering a mere variable in an equation. But fate, or the volatile market for human flesh, had another lesson in store. Finch went bankrupt. The estate was liquidated, and Lazarus, along with a handful of others, was sold at a frantic, chaotic auction to a man whose presence seemed to suck the very light from the air. Master number 5 was Reverend Elias Thorne. He was the hypocrite, a fire and brimstone preacher who owned a large, prosperous farm worked entirely by enslaved people. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that burned with a terrifying piety. He did not see a contradiction in his position. He saw a divine mandate. "Servants, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear," he would quote from the Bible, his voice a thunderous boom that echoed across the yard. He preached submission as a path to heavenly reward, turning the gospel of liberation into a manual for obedience. His cruelty was psychological warfare waged with scripture as the weapon. Sunday services were mandatory. Lazarus was forced to sit on hard benches and listen as Thorne detailed the horrors of hell that awaited the disobedient, the lazy, the sinful. And he made it clear that to disobey him, Master Thorne, was to disobey God himself. The whip here was not just leather. It was the threat of eternal damnation. A misstep wasn't just an infraction. It was a sin. Lazarus watched as other enslaved men and women internalized this, their spirits broken not by the lash, but by the terrifying weight of a twisted divinity. He saw the brilliant, malicious genius of it. It was Pettigrew's hypocrisy, weaponized and amplified to a terrifying degree. Thorne wasn't just breaking their bodies. He was trying to capture their very souls, to make them complicit in their own bondage. Lazarus learned to wear a mask of pious submission. He would bow his head in prayer, mutter Amen at the right times. Inside, the cold, hard weapon of his rage was being sharpened on the whetstone of this blasphemy. He learned that the most dangerous men were not the ones who reveled in their evil, but the ones who genuinely believed God was on their side. His reputation as a strong, seemingly compliant worker made him valuable. When Reverend Thorne's brother-in-law visited and expressed a need for a steady hand, a trade was arranged. Master number 6 was the sadist. His name was Roland Vane, and he owned a remote, fortified homestead where he bred fighting dogs. Vane was a man of few words and swift, brutal action. He enjoyed causing pain. It was not a means to an end. It was the end itself. His eyes held a vacant, predatory gleam. The lessons here were visceral and bloody. Vane's preferred instrument was not a whip, but a short, heavy cane. A misplaced tool, a look he didn't like, the simple fact of existing in his line of sight, any of these could earn a beating. Lazarus felt the crack of that cane on his shoulders, his back, his ribs. He learned to swallow his cries, because the sound of pain only seemed to excite Vane further. He was forced to care for the snarling, muscular dogs, beasts that were themselves products of cruelty. Vane would sometimes force Lazarus to stand perfectly still while he set the dogs on a chained-up old slave, a lesson in obedience and fear. The sound of the dogs barking, the snarling, the terrified screams, were a new kind of hell. Lazarus stood, his body rigid, his mind a fortress, locking away the horror, transforming it into fuel. It was under Vane that Lazarus completed a crucial part of his education. He learned the anatomy of violence. He saw where a blow could cripple and where it would only bruise. He learned the sounds a man makes when he is truly broken. And he learned the most important lesson of all, that men like Vane, for all their power, were fragile. They relied on fear. They were like their own fighting dogs, dangerous but predictable. They could be outthought. Vane, in a fit of rage over a lost bet, sold Lazarus on a whim to a passing trader, complaining he was too quiet, too sullen. As the wagon carried him away from the sounds of the barking dogs, Lazarus was no longer just a vessel of rage. He was a scholar of tyranny. He had studied under the greedy, the hypocrite, and the sadist. He understood the system, the ideology, and the brute force that propped it all up. The patient, sharp weapon within him was now polished, honed, and waiting. It needed only a final, unforgivable act to be put to use. The next link in the chain would be the last. The wagon carrying Lazarus from Roland Vane's house of pain did not travel far. It seemed the trader had a buyer already in mind, a man whose land bordered Vane's. The seventh master was, in his own way, the most terrifying of all. He was not a man of passionate greed, fervent hypocrisy, or violent sadism. He was simply empty. His name was Arthur Clay, and his was the face of apathy. His small, dusty farm was a place of slow decay. The fences were falling down. The fields were choked with weeds. The few slaves he owned moved with a lethargy born of pure hopelessness. Clay was a man broken by life, and he took his failure out on the only people he had power over. His cruelty was a passive thing, a neglect so profound it was a form of violence. He would often forget to feed them for days. Water was hauled from a muddy creek. There were no beatings, because that would require energy Clay did not possess. He simply did not care if they lived or died. For Lazarus, this was a new kind of hell. The fire of his rage, stoked by Thorne's hypocrisy and Vane's brutality, had nothing to burn here. It was smothered under a blanket of dust and indifference. He was not a man to be broken, but one to be forgotten, to slowly starve and fade away in this sun-bleached purgatory. It was here, in this vacuum of hope, that a tiny, fragile thing dared to spark back to life. Her name was Sarah. She was an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with a map of suffering. But her eyes held an ember of defiance. She was the unspoken leader of the few enslaved people on Clay's farm. She shared her meager rations with Lazarus, showed him how to find edible roots in the woods, and in the deep, silent nights, she spoke to him. She didn't speak of freedom, a concept too distant to grasp, but of the spirit. "They can own your body, Lazarus," she would whisper, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They can chain your hands and your feet, but don't you let them own what's in here." She tapped a bony finger against his chest. "That's your ground, your holy ground. You hold that and you ain't never truly a slave." Her words were water on a parched soul. For the first time since Eleanor and Isaiah were taken, Lazarus felt a connection. Sarah became a surrogate mother, a keeper of his story, a reminder of the man he used to be. In her, he saw a reflection of a future that wasn't just about enduring, but about preserving a shred of one's humanity. The cold, hard weapon of his vengeance softened, just a little, warmed by this unexpected, fragile love. It could not last. Arthur Clay, in a rare moment of motivation, decided to sell his failing farm. The assets, including his human property, were to be liquidated. Lazarus and Sarah were to be sold together, a pair. But on the day of the sale, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, the eighth master, arrived. He was a railroad speculator named Julian Fletcher, all sharp angles and calculating eyes. He only wanted Lazarus. The man looked strong. "I have need of strong backs for a grading project. The old woman is of no use to me." Lazarus, for the first time in years, spoke. His voice was rough from disuse. "We stay together," he said, his gaze fixed on Fletcher. "You buy us both or you get neither." Fletcher seemed amused by this display of spirit. He smiled a thin, cold smile. He looked at Clay, then at the trader. He nodded to Sarah. "Very well. A package deal." But it was a lie. As soon as the transaction was complete, the money exchanged, Fletcher's demeanor changed. He barked an order to his two overseers. "Bring the man. Leave the crone." Lazarus fought. He fought like a man possessed, the rage of years exploding to the surface. He threw off one overseer, his fist connecting with the other's jaw with a sickening crack. But he was outnumbered, beaten down with rifle butts until he was on his knees, his vision blurry, his arms pinned behind his back. Sarah stood watching, her face a mask of serene sorrow. She did not plead. She did not cry. She simply looked at Lazarus, her eyes holding his, pouring all her strength into him. Fletcher, dusting off his coat, walked over to her. "Sentiment," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "is the downfall of the weak." And then he did it. It was not an act of rage, but of cold, calculated demonstration. To show Lazarus who was master, to sever his last human connection, to prove that his will was an irrelevance. He drew a small, elegant pistol from his coat, leveled it at Sarah's forehead, and without another word, pulled the trigger. Sound of a single shocking gunshot that echoes and then fades into a ringing silence. The dissonant violin note cuts out abruptly. The sound was not loud. It was a small final pop, but to Lazarus it was the sound of the universe ending. Sarah dropped where she stood, a small, still heap on the dusty ground. The world went silent. The birds stopped singing. The wind held its breath. The overseers loosened their grip. Lazarus did not scream. He did not weep. He looked from Sarah's body to Julian Fletcher's impassive face. He saw the man holster the pistol, turn, and walk toward his horse as if he had just swatted a fly. In that absolute, crushing silence, the last, fragile bridge back to his humanity collapsed. The warmth Sarah had kindled was extinguished, and in its place the cold thing within him did not just return. It crystallized. It became an absolute, a fundamental law of his being. It was no longer just rage. It was purpose. As they dragged him away, his eyes, dry and burning, remained fixed on Fletcher's back. He did not see a man anymore. He saw a target, and in that moment the plan was born. Not a vague dream of revenge, but a specific, concrete and terrible design. He would not just kill Julian Fletcher. He would gather them all. Every single one. Every link in the chain. John Hawthorne, Silas Gable, Josiah Pettigrew, Alistair Finch, Elias Thorne, Roland Vane, Arthur Clay, and Julian Fletcher. He would bring them all together, and he would burn their world to the ground. The student's education was complete. The scholar of tyranny was now a graduate, and he was ready to write his thesis in fire. They transported Lazarus by river, the water a dark, indifferent ribbon carrying him toward his destiny. Julian Fletcher's railroad project was on the land of a man far wealthier and more powerful than himself. A man who owned the vast tracts of timber and earth the new line was meant to cross. This man, Fletcher's business partner and benefactor, was the ninth master, and he was by any measure the architect of the entire edifice Lazarus had suffered under. His name was Colonel William Barclay. a Revolutionary War veteran, a state senator, a man whose name was spoken with reverence and fear throughout the region. His plantation, Barclay's Reach, was not a farm. It was an empire. Neat, whitewashed slave cabins lined a street-like thoroughfare. Vast fields of cotton and tobacco stretched to the horizon, worked by hundreds of enslaved people moving with a synchronized mechanical precision. The big house was a sprawling Greek Revival mansion, its columns like bleached bones holding up the sky. This was the system itself personified, clean-ordered and absolute. The greed of Finch, the hypocrisy of Thorn, the sadism of Vane, the apathy of Clay, all were mere symptoms. Colonel Barclay was the disease. Lazarus was assigned not to the fields, but to the lumber crew, felling the ancient trees to clear the path for Fletcher's railroad. The work was a brutal echo of his time with Silas Gable, but on a colossal scale. The thunder of falling giants was the drumbeat of so-called progress. And it was here, amid the splintered wood and churned earth, that Lazarus found his opportunity. He learned the rhythms of the Barclay plantation. He saw how the colonel operated. Barclay was a man who believed in systems and hierarchies. He delegated. He trusted his overseers, his house servants, his business partners. He believed his own world was so perfectly ordered, so impregnable, that the idea of a threat from within was inconceivable. His greatest weakness was his arrogance, and Lazarus listened. He was invisible, a pair of strong arms, a silent face. He heard the other enslaved people talk. He heard the white overseers boast. He learned that Colonel Barclay was hosting a gathering, a grand business meeting to finalize the railroad contracts and celebrate the clearing of the land. It was to be a testament to his power and vision. Then, one evening, as Lazarus was sharpening axes by the fire, he heard the overseer listing the expected guests for the foreman. The names were a roll call of the damned. John Hawthorne, his first master, was coming. He was a supplier of tools and hardware. Silas Gable, the lumberman, was invited to discuss timber for the railroad ties. Josiah P. Pettigrew, the merchant, was providing provisions. Alastair Finch, though nearly bankrupt, was there as a minor investor, desperate for a stake. Reverend Elias Thorne was to give the blessing, sanctifying the enterprise. Roland Vane, the dog breeder, was not a business associate, but a hunting companion of the colonel's. He was coming for the sport. Arthur Clay, the apathetic farmer, had been invited out of pity, a charity gesture from the colonel, and Julian Fletcher. The railroad man, the murderer of Sarah, was the guest of honor. All nine masters under one roof. At Barclay's Reach, the coincidence was not lost on Lazarus. It felt less like chance and more like fate, a cruel cosmic irony offering him a perfect, terrible symmetry. The colonel, in his hubris, was gathering his entire world for a celebration. He was gathering the very men who represented every facet of Lazarus's hell. He was building the pyre himself and inviting the kindling. The plan, which had been a burning abstract in Lazarus's mind, now snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. The location was the big house. The time was the night of the party. The weapon was fire. It was the great equalizer. It was pure, indiscriminate, and it consumed everything, just like the system they had built. He began his final preparations. He noted the storage sheds, one of which held barrels of pine tar and turpentine used for preserving wood and as lamp fuel. He observed the comings and goings of the house slaves, learning the layout of the mansion's ground floor, the location of the main hall where the dinner would be held. He saw that the French doors to the veranda would be left open in the late summer heat. Colonel Barclay, the ninth master, had become an unwitting accomplice. He had provided the stage, gathered the players, and even stored the means of their destruction. He saw Lazarus not as a man, not as a threat, but as a component in his machine. A tool. And tools, as Lazarus knew better than anyone, can be turned in the hand of the user. The cold, crystalline purpose inside him was now a guiding star. There was no fear, no doubt, only the grim mechanics of the task ahead. He was no longer a slave planning an act of rebellion. He was a force of nature preparing to correct an imbalance. A reckoning was coming to Barclay's Reach, and its name was Lazarus. The days leading to the gathering at Barclay's Reach were a study in excruciating normalcy. For Lazarus, it was as if the world had slowed, every second stretching into an hour, every movement requiring conscious, deliberate effort. He moved through his work with the same stoic diligence he had always shown, but beneath the surface, his mind was a clockwork of calculation, ticking down to a single terrible moment. He was a quiet storm, gathering its strength, hiding its fury behind a mask of placid clouds. His first task was the turpentine. The storage shed was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. During the noonday break, when the overseers dozed in the shade and the air was thick with heat, Lazarus used a bent nail he had secreted away to pick the simple mechanism. The click of the lock opening was deafening in the silence. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp, pungent smell of pine. Barrels of turpentine and pots of thick, sticky pine tar were stacked against the wall. He needed a vessel. The next day, while hauling water from the well for the mules, he accidentally let a hollowed-out gourd, used as a drinking dipper, fall and crack beyond repair. He was scolded and assigned to carve a new one. That night, by the faint light of a sliver of moon, he did just that. But he carved two, one to replace the broken one, and another, larger one, which he carefully sealed with pine pitch. It was crude, but it would hold liquid. It would be his weapon. Stealing the turpentine was the greatest risk. He had to be a ghost. On the eve of the grand dinner, he slipped away during the shift change, a time of minor chaos as day crews swapped with night watchmen. He moved not like a man, but like a shadow, flowing from the cover of one oak tree to the next, his breathing shallow. He reached the shed, picked the lock again, and using a stolen funnel made from rolled bark, he filled the large gourd with the clear, volatile liquid. The smell was overpowering, a scent he would forever associate with justice. He sealed the gourd, hid it under a pile of scrap wood near the edge of the lumber yard, a place he had chosen days earlier, and melted back into the twilight. The tools were ready. But the man had to be ready too, that final night. As the big house began to glow with lamplight and the sounds of laughter and clinking glass drifted down from the hill, Lazarus sat alone in the darkness of his cabin. The other men were asleep, exhausted from the day's labor. He could hear the music from the mansion, a genteel waltz, a sound of a world that was not his. He closed his eyes and the faces came to him, not as ghosts to haunt him, but as targets to solidify his resolve. John Hawthorne, signing the paper. Silas Gable, spitting out the name Lays, Josiah Pettigrew, tapping his cane, Alistair Finch, muttering over his ledger, Reverend Thorne, thundering about hell, Roland Vane with his predatory smile, Arthur Clay, with his empty eyes, Julian Fletcher, raising the pistol, and Sarah falling. He did not pray. He had finished with gods the day Thorne had preached. Instead, he meditated on the geometry of the house, the placement of the doors, the flow of the air. He thought of fire, how it would start as a tiny, hungry thing and then grow, feeding on the opulence, the fine draperies, the polished wood, the very pride of the men inside. It would be a purifier. It would reduce their fine suits, their documents, their power to ash. It would be the one thing they could not control, could not buy, could not preach into submission. There was no fear in him now. The emotion had been burned away, leaving only a core of absolute, glacial certainty. He was not a murderer. He was a surgeon, and the cancer he was cutting out was the rot of 9 souls. He was the consequence of 1,000 lashes, 1,000,000 slights, a lifetime of stolen moments. He was the sum total of their cruelty, given form and purpose. A little past midnight, the party in the big house reached its peak. The music was louder, the laughter more raucous. He could picture them in the main hall, glasses raised, congratulating themselves on their enterprise, their dominion over the land and the people on it. They felt secure in their fortress. They did not know the fortress had been breached from within. Lazarus stood up. The cabin was silent. He moved to the door and slipped out into the night. The air was still and heavy. He retrieved the gourd from its hiding place. The liquid sloshed inside, a promise of the storm to come. He looked up at the big house, a jewel of light and arrogance against the dark sky. He took a breath, not of a nervous man, but of an artist before the first brushstroke. The quiet was over. The storm was here. The world had narrowed to a single, dark path between the slave quarters and the brilliant glow of the big house. Lazarus moved with a predator's grace, his body a shadow among shadows. The gourd of turpentine, sloshing gently in his hand, was no longer a tool. It was an extension of his will. The laughter and music from the mansion were not sounds of celebration to him, but the bleating of sheep who did not know the wolf was already among them. He approached from the rear, where the kitchens and service entrances lay. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat and sweet pastries, smells that were a world away from the coarse cornmeal and fatback that sustained him. He saw the silhouettes of the house slaves moving wearily behind the windows, clearing the final courses. They were his people, yet they were on the other side of a pane of glass, part of the machine he was about to shatter. He felt a pang of something, not regret, but a grim acknowledgement that the fire would not discriminate. But the path was chosen. There was no turning back. The French doors to the main hall were, as he predicted, open to the sultry night air. Golden light spilled out, illuminating a section of the veranda. From his vantage point in the deep darkness of a magnolia tree, he could see them, all of them. There was John Hawthorne, his face flushed with wine, clapping a portly Silas Gable on the back. Josiah Pettigrew was in deep conversation with Reverend Thorne, no doubt discussing the moral virtues of their profitable enterprise. Alistair Finch stood near the periphery, looking small and anxious, while Roland Vane laughed too loudly at a story Colonel Barclay was telling. Arthur Clay sat slumped in a chair, looking as out of place as a weed in a rose garden. And at the center of it all was Julian Fletcher, smiling that thin, cold smile, accepting a glass of brandy from the Colonel himself. The sight of them, gathered in their self-congratulatory circle, was the final confirmation. It was time. He waited for the perfect moment. A group of slaves exited the main hall, carrying large trays of empty oyster shells and glassware. In that brief flurry of activity, Lazarus moved. He was a wisp of darkness, flowing from the magnolia's shadow to the deeper darkness just beyond the veranda's railing. He uncorked the gourd. The pungent, sharp smell of turpentine bloomed in the air, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of the night-blooming jasmine. He did not pour it wildly. He was methodical, precise. He traced a line along the base of the veranda's wooden wall, a trail of clear, volatile liquid that seeped into the dry, aged timber. He poured a generous pool beneath a stack of dry floral arrangements and a pile of discarded linen napkins. This was the kindling. Then, moving with agonizing slowness, he edged along the side of the house, pouring a thin, continuous stream that led to a stack of firewood piled neatly against the kitchen wall. He emptied the last of the gourd there, the liquid soaking deep into the split logs. The stage was set. The house was primed. From his pocket he pulled a flint and a small piece of steel he used for lighting his forge in another life. He knelt by the initial pool of turpentine near the veranda. He took one last look through the French doors. They were all still there, trapped in their golden bubble of ignorance and power. He struck the flint. A sharp, crisp sound of flint on steel, followed by a loud, explosive whoosh of igniting turpentine. The waltz music cuts off abruptly, replaced by the terrifying crackle of hungry fire. The fire did not start. It erupted. It raced along the trail he had laid, a blazing serpent that instantly climbed the veranda walls and engulfed the dry flowers and linens. A woman's scream tore through the night, sharp and piercing. Then another. The genteel music was replaced by shouts of confusion that quickly morphed into roars of pure panic. Lazarus did not run. He stood his ground in the shadows, watching. He saw the flames leap from the veranda to the lace curtains inside the main hall. He saw the stack of firewood by the kitchen ignite with a thunderous roar, cutting off one of the main escape routes. The fire was a living thing now, feeding on the opulence, growing with terrifying speed. It had a voice, a roar that drowned out the screams of the men inside. He saw silhouettes now, not of powerful men, but of terrified animals. He saw Hawthorne and Gable stumbling back from the advancing wall of heat. He saw Pettigrew trying to beat at the flames with his jacket, only to have it catch fire himself. He saw Reverend Thorne, his hands raised to the heavens, not in blessing, but in a futile plea for deliverance. But Lazarus's eyes were fixed on Julian Fletcher. He saw the railroad man try to make for the French doors, but a falling beam wreathed in fire crashed down, blocking the exit. Fletcher recoiled, his face a mask of terror, his fine clothes suddenly looking pathetic. For a fleeting second, his eyes, wide with horror, scanned the darkness outside the ring of fire. And they met Lazarus's. There was no recognition of the man, only the sight of a dark, still figure standing calmly in the chaos. A figure of judgment. In that single, shared glance, Lazarus poured all the silent years, the stolen family, the murdered Sarah, the endless chain of suffering. He made sure Fletcher saw him. He made sure the last thing the man understood was that this was not an accident. This was design. Then the ceiling of the main hall began to collapse. A rain of fire and splintered timber fell upon the men inside. The screams reached a fever pitch and then, one by one, they were swallowed by the inferno. The heat was so intense that Lazarus had to take a step back, the skin on his face tightening. The big house was a funeral pyre, a blazing tomb for 9 masters. He had done it. He had gathered them and burned them alive. The vengeance was complete. The cold, hard thing inside him, the patient weapon forged over a lifetime, was finally, utterly spent. He turned his back on the roaring hellscape. He did not look back. He walked away, not with triumph, but with a profound and empty silence. He walked past the slave quarters, where people were now emerging, their faces illuminated by the raging fire, their expressions a mixture of terror and something else, something like awe. He did not speak to them. He simply walked, leaving the light and the heat and the screams behind him, and disappeared into the welcoming, endless dark of the North Carolina night. Dawn did not break over Barclay's Reach so much as it seeped through a sky stained grey with ash. The grand mansion was gone. Where columns and opulence had stood was a skeletal ruin, a blackened scar on the earth, steaming and hissing like a dying beast. The air, once sweet with jasmine, was now thick with the acrid, unforgettable stench of burnt timber, melted glass, and something else, something that made the white families who gathered on the lawn cover their noses with handkerchiefs and avert their eyes. The silence was the most profound sound. It was a heavy blanket smothering the usual morning chorus of birds and farm life. It was the silence of shock, of a world violently unmade. Then the whispers began, rippling through the crowd of overseers, neighbors, and terrified house slaves. No one could have survived. Not in that, the colonel. All of them. Gone. They said it started in 3 places at once. How can that be? The local magistrate, a man named Prentice, arrived on a lathered horse, his face pale. He directed a handful of men to sift through the wreckage. It was a grim task. The heat had been so intense that little remained. They found melted silverware fused to blackened bone. They found the colonel's signet ring in a pile of cinders. They found 9 distinct piles of remains, but they were not 9 men. They were 9 monuments to ash. The official story, the one hastily drafted by Magistrate Prentice by midday, was a tragic accident. A stray spark from a fireplace, perhaps, an overturned lamp, the dry summer wood. It was a story the white community clung to, a narrative that allowed them to mourn without confronting a more terrifying truth. But another story was already being born. It was born in the slave quarters, passed in hushed tones from one person to the next, a story that moved like a current under the still surface of the official record. It was a story about a man named Lazarus, a man who had been wronged by every one of the men in that house, a man who had been seen, calm and resolute, watching the fire from the shadows before vanishing into the night. The overseers heard these whispers. They dragged a young stable boy trembling before Magistrate Prentice. The boy, through choked sobs, confessed he had seen Lazarus near the kitchen yard after midnight. He spoke of the gourd. He spoke of the intense, focused look on the man's face. The magistrate's blood ran cold. The convenient fiction of an accident shattered. This was rebellion. This was a challenge to the very foundation of their world. If one slave could do this, what was to stop others? The fear was palpable, a contagion more dangerous than any fire. By that afternoon, the manhunt began. It was not a search. It was a frenzy. Flyers were printed with a crude description of Lazarus. Patrols of armed men on horseback, their faces set in grim masks, scoured the roads and paths. They beat the underbrush with sticks, fired shots into thickets to flush out any hiding place. They offered rewards, turning neighbor against neighbor, instigating a terror meant to snuff out the spark Lazarus had ignited. They searched the swamps, the deep woods, the hidden hollows. They questioned every black person they encountered, their questions laced with the threat of the lash or the noose. But they found nothing. No trace, no footprint. No stolen food from a smokehouse. Lazarus had not just run. He had evaporated. To the slave-owning class, this was incomprehensible. A man of his size, with no resources, couldn't just disappear. Their failure to find him only amplified the myth. With every empty-handed day that passed, the man they hunted grew in stature. He was no longer just a runaway slave. He was a phantom, a spirit of vengeance that had walked out of the flames and simply ceased to be. The charred ruins of Barclay's Reach stood as a silent, accusing monument. The laughter was gone. The power was gone. All that remained was ash, silence, and a single terrifying question hanging in the air. Where is he? And is he watching us still? With every passing day that the posses returned empty-handed, the man known as Lazarus began to die, and the legend known as Lazarus began to live. He slipped from the realm of flesh and blood into the realm of story. A ghost story told in two different worlds, for two very different reasons. In the white community, in the manor houses and taverns, he became a cautionary tale, a spectral threat. Lock your doors, mothers would whisper to their children. Behave or the fireman will get you. He was a monster, a demon of vengeance summoned from some dark pit. His name was used to justify tighter patrols, harsher punishments, a more paranoid grip on the enslaved population. He was the reason they gave for their own escalating brutality. In their telling, he was not a man pushed to the edge, but a born fiend, an anomaly of nature. But in the quarters, in the hushed spaces between labors, the story was told differently. It was not told with fear, but with a fierce secret pride. It was a story of a man who had looked into the face of Leviathan and made it blink. He was not the fireman. He was the man who walked with fire. He was the one who got away, and where had he gone? The most powerful belief, the one that took root in the rich soil of collective hope, was that he had vanished into the great dismal swamp. That vast, trackless wilderness on the border of North Carolina and Virginia was a place of mystery and fear for the white man, but a place of legend and potential sanctuary for the enslaved. It was said to be inhabited by maroon communities, secret societies of runaways who had carved out a free, if difficult, existence in its murky heart. And so, the legend was born. Lazarus was there. He was the silent king of the swamp. Some claim to have seen his ghostly figure moving through the cypress knees, draped in Spanish moss. Others said he led a community of hundreds, training them in the arts of resistance. A traveling preacher, secretly aiding the Underground Railroad, would whisper that Lazarus had created a new 10 commandments for the oppressed, and the first was, "Thou shalt not suffer a master to live." Every unsolved fire on a plantation for decades to come would be attributed to him. Every overseer who turned up dead in a ditch was said to have seen his face. He became a convenient and powerful specter for any act of defiance, large or small. He was no longer one man. He was every suppressed thought of freedom, every silent curse, every hidden desire for justice, given a name and a face. But what of the real man, the one with the scarred back, and the memories of a wife named Eleanor and a son named Isaiah, the one who had held the gourd of turpentine with hands that once tenderly held his child? The truth is, no one knows. History, written by the powerful, recorded the fire as a tragic accident and the slave named Lazarus as simply missing, presumed dead. Oral history, carried in the hearts of the oppressed, kept him alive, breathing new life into his story with every telling. Perhaps he did find the maroons in the swamp and lived out his days in a freedom forged by his own terrible hands. Perhaps he died of fever in a murky bog, his body never found, his vengeance his only epitaph. Or perhaps, in the most poetic version of the legend, he never left Barclay's reach at all. That his spirit remained bound to the scorched earth, an eternal sentinel ensuring that the memory of that night and the reasons for it would never be completely erased. The manhunt eventually ended. The rewards went unclaimed. The wanted posters faded and tore in the rain. The system, shaken, rebuilt itself, perhaps a little more fearful, a little more cruel in its insecurity. But they could not kill the story. They could not capture the ghost, because a ghost does not need food or water. A ghost does not leave footprints. A ghost feeds on fear in one house and on hope in another. And as long as the story was whispered in the quarters, as long as a mother told her child about the man who burned 9 masters alive, Lazarus was not just a ghost in the swamp. He was a seed in the mind, a seed of the unthinkable possibility that chains could be broken, that power was not eternal, and that even the smallest ember of rage, if nursed in silence long enough, could one day unleash an inferno. The ashes of Barclay's Reach were long ago reclaimed by the earth. The names of the 9 masters are footnotes in dusty ledgers, their power and prestige reduced to a cautionary tale. But the story of Lazarus endures. It forces its way up through the layers of official history like a stubborn root, refusing to be forgotten. It is not a comfortable story. It does not offer easy morals or clean resolutions. Instead, it sits with us, a heavy and eternal question mark. What are we to make of Lazarus? Was he a monster? A hero? A victim who became a perpetrator? Perhaps these are the wrong questions, categories too small to contain the vast, terrible truth of his experience. To call him a monster is to ignore the system that manufactured him. To call him a hero is to sanitize the horror of his actions. He was simply a man who was systematically stripped of everything a man holds dear, his family, his dignity, his name, his right to love, and finally, his very humanity. And in that absolute void, what grew was not forgiveness, not patience, but a cold, focused, and absolute rage. His story holds up a dark mirror to the peculiar institution of slavery. It asks us, what did they expect? Did they truly believe they could endlessly grind human souls into the dust without creating something sharp and deadly in the process? Lazarus was not an anomaly. He was a logical conclusion. He was the embodied consequence of a crime against nature itself. His vengeance was a force as elemental as the fire he wielded, a destructive and purifying response to an unbearable oppression. This story also forces us to confront the uncomfortable nature of justice in an unjust world. The courts, the laws, the entire structure of society were arrayed against him. There was no legal recourse, no peaceful appeal. The justice he delivered was not a court's justice. It was the raw, brutal justice of the oppressed. A justice born not from law books, but from the primal need for a reckoning. It is a stark reminder that when a system is fundamentally corrupt, the lines between criminal and avenger, between terrorism and rebellion, become tragically blurred. Lazarus's true legacy is not in the 9 lives he took, but in the story he left behind. A story that was whispered through the generations, a secret weapon of the mind. It was a story that said, you are not alone in your hatred. You are not crazy for your rage. Someone once looked the master in the eye and said, no more. He became a symbol not of the violence itself, but of the indomitable will that violence represented, the refusal to be extinguished. The echo of Lazarus's revenge is not just a sound from the past. It is a question that resonates through time, asking us to remember the human cost of absolute power. It asks us to consider the invisible lines of endurance and what happens when they are crossed. And it leaves us with a final haunting thought, that buried deep within the quietest soul, under the weight of unbearable injustice, there sometimes sleeps an ember. And an ember, no matter how small, always has the potential to become an inferno.